Economy and Industry Minister Eli Cohen says that Israel's power depends on its economic growth.
With a population of just about 9.5 million people, Israel produces more tech startups per capita than the US, China, and Europe combined. Wondering how possible that could be? In 2023 alone, Israel secured over $10 billion in venture capital funds, ranking third globally, behind the United States and China. So, how is it that a country with no oil and barely the size of New Jersey is now regarded as one of the most advanced and secure economies on Earth? In this video, we will reveal the biggest secret behind Israel's rise to become an economic superpower. It is hard to walk through the streets of Tel Aviv today without hearing the phrase "Startup Nation" mentioned at every corner, but this label is not just a branding gimmick. Data from Statista shows that there are about 4,580 active startups in Israel, making it one of the world's most densely populated startup ecosystems. Per capita, no other country comes close. The heart of this ecosystem is known as Silicon Wadi, a stretch of coastal land extending from Tel Aviv to Haifa. Wadi translates to valley in both Arabic and Hebrew. And much like Silicon Valley in California, this region is also saturated with cutting-edge innovation. In fact, the technology industry's exports of goods and services accounted for nearly 53% of Israel's total national exports. This included cutting-edge technology in cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, agri-tech, aerospace, and fintech. However, this transformation did not occur overnight, nor was it a mere accident. It took decades of planning, targeted risk-taking, and several clever partnerships to achieve. One of the driving forces behind this rise was Israel's culture of innovation through necessity. The nation is no stranger to constant geopolitical tension since founded in 1948. This has compelled it to develop high-level defense technologies, many of which later found commercial applications. For instance, cybersecurity expertise developed in military intelligence units, such as Unit 8200, has directly led to the creation of some of the world's top private cybersecurity companies, including Checkpoint Software Technologies and CyberArk. What's fascinating is how military training feeds directly into the country's economy. In most other countries, mandatory service is seen as a pause in one's career. But in Israel, it is often regarded as the beginning. Many Israeli tech founders are reported to have served in elite intelligence or cyber units, where they acquired not only technical skills, but also the ability to manage high-pressure situations, solve problems rapidly, and lead teams. This early exposure to high-stakes innovation became the foundation for a startup culture that prospers on speed and resilience. However, military roots alone cannot explain why global tech giants continue to pour billions into Israel. Companies like Google, Meta, Amazon, and Nvidia have opened research centers here, not just because of the talent, but how the talent is supported. The Israeli government has, for years, rolled out incentives that make investing in research and development extremely attractive to startups. One major player in this space is the Israel Innovation Authority, which operates under the Ministry of Economy and Industry. This agency provides grants, subsidized loans, and R&D partnerships that reduce the risk of foreign investors while supporting homegrown businesses. In 2023, the Innovation Authority allocated over $110 million in support for technology projects across various fields, including quantum computing, clean energy, and health technology. According to data from Startup Nation Central, Israeli tech startups alone raised over $12 billion in funding back in 2024. Israeli firms such as OurCrowd, Pitango, and Aleph now compete with international giants like Sequoia and Excel for a slice of Israeli innovation. Israel is also leading in patents and innovation metrics. In the evolving AI-related patents specifically, the country has made substantial gains over the last decade while outperforming larger economies like Germany and the UK. One of the most important yet often overlooked reasons for Israel's startup dominance is the country's support for education and infrastructure. Israel has consistently ranked in the top 10 globally for percentage of GDP spent on R&D. So, how did this tiny nation of Israel, surrounded by conflict and drought, become the world's second Silicon Valley? That question leads us back 3 decades, to a program that quietly changed everything. To understand the engine beneath Israel's startup explosion, you have to go back to the early 1990s. Back then, many foreign investors still viewed Israel as a highly unstable and risky country, where venture capital was almost non-existent. The country's economy was still recovering from decades of inflation and centralized control. And then came the Yozma program. Yozma, which means initiative in Hebrew, was launched in 1993 by the Israeli government with a bold, almost radical idea. What if the state used its own money to reduce the risk of private investment in tech startups? In other words, the government was offering to match private investments in tech startups nationwide by providing approximately $8 million for every $12 million raised by venture capital firms. In return, the state would hold a 40% stake in the fund, but with one important twist: if any of these ventures succeeds, the private firm would have the right to buy out the government's share. If it failed, the risk was shared. This meant the good part of the deal belonged mostly to private players, while the government's main role was to make innovation less scary for those with the money. This flipped the usual public-private investment logic on its head, and it did work. Within just a few years of its launch, the Yozma consisted of 10 new venture capital funds, managed $20 million each, and were capitalized with a combination of government funds and foreign investment. Yozma also made 15 direct investments, and 9 of these enjoyed successful exits, either through public offerings or acquisitions. Unlike other countries that poured billions into national development projects only to drown in debt, Israel's Yozma strategy had almost zero long-term cost to the government. The success of its first round meant that most of the public funds were eventually returned with interest. The Yozma program also led a broader shift in how Israel supported innovation within the state. At around the same time of its launch, the government began cutting its corporate taxes on tech firms, reducing them from 23% to as low as 7.5% in some cases. By the end of the 1990s, Israel had moved from a heavily centralized economy into a risk-sharing innovation economy. The government's job was not to pick winners, but to give smart people a runway to shine. Between 1990 and 2000, the number of tech startups in Israel grew more than tenfold, with venture capital funding going from almost zero to over $3 billion annually by the early 2000s. More importantly, businesses in Israel began listing on the Nasdaq at a record pace, according to Wikipedia sources. At one point in the early 2000s, Israel had more companies listed on Nasdaq than any other country outside the United States and China. And while the initial Yozma program eventually came to an end, the current Israel Innovation Authority continued many of the same functions, such as connecting early-stage startups with both government support and global venture capital networks. Today, many nations still struggle to copy the Yozma model. This is because they either get the incentives wrong or the partnerships fail within a short time altogether. But for Israel, this experiment was more than just an intelligent policy. It was the moment when the country stopped betting on survival and began to bet on what it was willing to offer its people. However, there was one enormous storm that still had to be overcome: hyperinflation, and it nearly destroyed everything. Before the world saw Israel as a land of high-tech miracles, it nearly collapsed under the weight of its own economy. In 1984, Israel's inflation reached a jaw-dropping 445% as prices were doubling almost every few weeks. Families were rushing to spend their salaries the moment they got paid, because waiting even a day meant their money would keep losing its value. This was no longer a recession, it was a state of chaos. At the time, Israel was facing a dangerous combination of loose fiscal policies, massive public debt, and excessive money printing. The government had grown used to spending beyond its means, subsidizing nearly every sector, and trying to solve every problem by throwing money at it. Meanwhile, at the time, the Bank of Israel was also not truly independent, as it became a tool for top politicians of the day, who often pressured it to print more money in an attempt to cover their shortfalls. The result of this, a full-blown inflation never seen before. To understand the level of public distrust in the country, consider this: by 1984, only 3% of bank deposits in Israel were in the local currency, the shekel. Everyone else had switched to United States dollars and were treating them like their real money. In other words, the shekel had become a joke, something people used only when they had no choice. This continued until Shimon Peres became the country's prime minister in September 1984, alongside his finance minister, Yitzhak Wadi. Peres launched what became known as the 1985 Economic Stabilization Plan, a coordinated, no-nonsense rescue mission aimed at stopping the economic bleeding and restoring credibility to Israel's economy. The first move, a complete freeze on public sector wages and prices. Of course, this move was controversial as it meant workers' salaries were locked in place, and so were the prices of essentials such as bread, fuel, and rent. Without such drastic steps, inflation would have kept climbing. Second, the government significantly reduced its public spending. Dozens of unproductive state-owned enterprises were either sold off or restructured. Government subsidies were rolled back, and new hires into government roles were also frozen. Peres and Wadi knew the math, and Israel could no longer afford to live beyond its means. And then came the most important move of them all: restricting the issuance of new money. The supply of shekel was controlled like never before, and the goal was simple: starve inflation of its fuel. However, that alone was not enough because people had to believe that these reforms would last. They had to trust that future governments would not undo everything, and that is where the real turning point came, granting full independence to the Central Bank of Israel. Until then, the central bank had operated like a puppet whose strings were tied to the ruling party. After the reforms, the bank was given a clear mandate to fight inflation first, then everything else second. This means it's no longer had to take orders from the Prime Minister or even the Parliament. It became a guardian of monetary stability. This move was not just symbolic, it changed the law. A new governor, Michael Bruno, was appointed soon after, with the full authority to set the country's interest rates and monetary policy. And he used that power decisively, as interest rates were raised to painful levels to curb demand and slow the economy temporarily, so that prices could settle. And it worked. Inflation, which had reached over 400% in 1984, dropped to less than 20% by 1986, and then to under 10% in the early 1990s. For a country that was used to ever-increasing prices, this was like stepping into a new world. Even more striking was how the use of the shekel bounced back. Israelis began keeping their savings in their local currency again, and by 2002, nearly 38% of all deposits had returned to shekels. By the mid-1990s, the economy was growing steadily, with its GDP expanding at an average annual rate of 5%. The budget deficit was reduced and foreign reserves increased, providing Israel with a cushion against future shocks. In many ways, the success of the 1985 plan was not in its flashiness, but in how disciplined it made the entire country, and perhaps most crucially, it sent a clear message to the world. Israel was serious about becoming a real economy, not a constantly failing experiment. Still, economic tools alone can only take a country so far, so the next step in how Israel became a full-blown innovation and technological hub required something else entirely. If you look at a map, Israel is not the kind of place that should be economically powerful. It has no oil reserves, access to little fresh water, and is bordered by political uncertainty on almost every side. Yet it becomes an economic powerhouse. How? The answer lies in its people, the talent, the urgency, and the ingenuity that grew out of absolute necessity. Let's start with immigration. In the early 1990s, Israel experienced one of the most influential influxes of skilled labour in modern history. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union between 1989 and 2006, over 1.6 million Jews left the former USSR and returned to Israel, which boosted its population by nearly 20%. These new immigrants brought advanced education, particularly in fields such as engineering, physics, mathematics, and computer science. Many of them had worked in Soviet R&D programs or technical institutes, so Israel suddenly had a huge deposit of people who were ready to work, solve problems, and rebuild their lives. The government helped them quickly through housing assistance, job training, and language education. Universities in Israel opened additional STEM programs, and employers were encouraged to hire these new immigrants, particularly in tech. At the same time, Israel's mandatory military service became an unexpected economic tool. Young men and women were placed in high-pressure, high-tech military units, especially within the intelligence and cyber branches across sectors. Today, Israel ranks number 1 in R&D expenditure as a percentage of GDP, number 2 in venture capital availability, and consistently sits in the top 10 destinations for innovation indexes. Thank you for watching. Which of the factors above do you think made Israel become a global economic superpower? Please hit the like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.